Hello, this is video number 2 of Continuing Learning. So video 1 was about converting fractions to decimals. This video is converting decimals to fractions. So this video is going to kind of start with some information already on here. I got interrupted, so I had to start over on my video. So we're going to start with converting decimals to fractions. And the first thing we're going to talk about is place value. So we need to be able to read our decimals using mathematical vocabulary. And the big part of that is being able to read them accurately. So instead of saying point, we're going to use the word and for a decimal place. So a decimal has a whole number to begin with. So to the left of the decimal point, we're going to have a whole number. Now that whole number could be a positive number, it could be a negative number, it could even be the number 0. But we have to have this whole value, and then we have our decimal place. And then you have our place values in our decimals. So we have the tenths. If your decimal just had one digit to the right of the decimal value, that would be called a tenth. So let's pretend there's a 3 right here. That would be 3/10. And if this decimal had 2 digits to the right of the decimal, that would be hundredths. So let's pretend it said a 1 and a 3. That would be 13 hundredths. Then 3 decimal places would be thousandths. So if that was a 1, and a 3. That was, I'll show you, if that was a 1, and a 3, that would be 113 thousandths. The next place is 10 thousandths and so on. There is a decimal place value chart on page 4 of your notebook, if you have your notebook with you, so you can go back and reference that if you need to practice reading decimals correctly. But we're going to be converting, we're going to be changing decimals to fractions. So there are 2 types of decimals that we're going to work with. And the first one is called a terminating decimal. And a terminating decimal is a decimal that comes to an end. It stops. It doesn't have any repeating process in it. There's no ... at the end. There's no pattern that repeats. It just comes to an end. And so if a decimal comes to an end, if it stops, the first thing we want to do is read the decimal correctly. And again, that's why it's so important that we have these vocabulary terms up here to remind us what that looks like. Because if you read it correctly, for example, if you said 0.7, that's a decimal that ends. If I read it correctly, instead of saying 0.7, if I said 7, and it's 1 decimal, so 7/10, that's my fraction, 7/10. Because if I read it correctly, if I read the decimal, the denominator is the place value. Yesterday we talked, in our previous lesson, we talked about denominators, right? The denominator is the bottom number. The denominator is your place value. And since my place value right here is the tenths place, my fraction value is 7/10. If I read my decimal correctly and I said it was 77 hundredths, my denominator would be 100. Because if I read the decimal correctly, the denominator is the place value, right? The denominator of my fraction is going to be the place value that it matches with. Then I need to ask myself, does it need to be simplified? And if it does need to be simplified, we're going to go ahead and go through that process of simplifying it. So we need to just remember, if it's an even numerator, top number, and an even denominator, bottom number, they both get divided by 2, and we keep doing that until it's simplified. If you have a scientific calculator at home, remember the scientific calculator will simplify for you. Your phone does not have that capability to simplify fractions for you. But you can probably go online if you have access to the internet, and you can go in and just Google the fraction, and lots of times it simplifies it for you. You could Google fraction calculator, and go online and have the calculator on the internet do some simplifying for you. So there are a couple of options of how you can get a fraction simplified if that's something that you're struggling with. So a terminating decimal is a decimal that ends. It comes to a stop. The other type of fraction and decimal combo is a repeating decimal. And a repeating decimal, remember, a repeating decimal is a decimal that repeats a pattern. So it has to have a pattern that repeats. And in order to convert a repeating decimal into a fraction, we're going to only talk about the simple ones. So we're only going to focus on simple repeating decimals. And to do simple repeating decimals, step number 1 is to read the decimal correctly. Just like step number 1 was up here. Step number 1 is to read the decimal correctly, because this is your fraction. But there's an additional step with repeating decimals because they repeat. When I read my decimal correctly, so if I said this was my decimal, 0.7 repeating. If I read that correctly, it's 7/10 repeating. So I read it correctly. That's my fraction. But in order to ensure that I know the difference between these two fractions, because this one ends, it's a terminating decimal, but this one's a repeating decimal. So they have to be different somehow. And this is the difference. When it's a repeating decimal, read it correctly. That's your fraction. Now you subtract 1 from the denominator. So instead of it being 7/10 fraction, 7/10, because it's 7/10 repeating, it's actually 7/9. And then you can always ask yourself, does it need to be simplified? So let's do some practice. We are going to, I'm going to give you some decimals down here that we are going to convert. So we're going to start out with 0.4. We will do 14.08, 4.3, negative 2.5, negative 3.001, negative 8.14, 8.16, 0.5 repeating, and 0.75. Let's make this one repeating too right here. All right, so again, if you do not have a scientific calculator, but you do have access to the internet, you can Google a fraction calculator and it will simplify fractions for you if necessary. So we're going to go through and practice reading these correctly. So instead of saying 0.4, I would say 4/10. So 4/10 is my fraction because that is a terminating decimal. I read it correctly. This is my fraction. Does it need to be simplified? Well, 4 and 10 are both even, so they can both be divided by 2. So the fraction value is 2/5. I can check myself. I could say, okay, does 2 divided by 5? Oh, look, it equals 0.4. So I know that I did that correctly. 2/5 and 0.4 are equal. This is the decimal, and this is the fraction value. Over here, I'm going to read my decimal correctly, is -2 and 5/10. -2 and 5/10. Lots of us can recognize without a calculator that 5/10 is the same thing as 1/2. Next fraction is 8 and 16/100. 8 and 16/100. I could go through the process and say 16 and 100 are both even, and keep going that way, or I can, in my calculator or online, if you go to an online calculator, I can type the fraction 8 and 16/100. You can go online to a fraction calculator if you don't have a scientific calculator at home and simplify. And remember, in our scientific calculator, sometimes I get this. And, oops, I did the wrong button. 8, I cleared it. 8 and 16/100. And I get this weird improper fraction. And if I look right down here, let's get really close. On a scientific calculator, this takes a fraction to a mixed number, and it's in green. So I have to press the green second button, and then that conversion. Come on, Mrs. Long, stop pressing the wrong buttons. There we go. And my answer is 8 and 4/25. Next one is 14 and 8/100. 14 and 8/100. I could say, oh, 8 and 100 are both even, so they can be divided by 2. Or if you want to go to the internet or use your calculator, I can put in 14 and 8/100. My calculator gave me an improper fraction. My improper fraction to mixed number button is right here in green, so I'm going to press this button, but in order to get the green, I have to press the second and then that button to get there. Press enter. So my simplified version is 14 and 2/25. My next fraction is -3 and 1. There are 3 places. 1,000th. A little trick that can help is, since there are 3 digits in my decimal, to the right of my decimal, I know that there are going to be 3 zeros in my denominator. Up here, there were 2 digits, so there were 2 zeros in my original denominator. Here we have a repeating decimal. So let's go to our repeating rules, and it says read the decimal correctly. Check. Which is 5/10 repeating. But because it's a repeating decimal, I have to subtract 1 from the denominator. So it turns into 5/9. Because I stopped boxing my answers for you guys. 4.3, 4 and 3/10. 4 and 3/10. And 3/10 does not simplify. -8 and 14/100. Oh, but it's a repeating decimal, so I'm going to subtract 1. So it becomes -8 and 14/99. I'm going to test to see if this simplifies. I don't remember if it should. Maybe instead of simplifying, like up here when I was simplifying 8 and 16/100 and I was having to go through all those steps to see if the fraction simplified, but I was using mixed numbers, maybe I could just simplify just the fraction part, not the the whole number part. Let's see if that works. 16/100. Do you think that simplifies? Oh, it does. So I don't even need to when I'm simplifying. I don't need that whole number in it. I could just simplify just the fraction part, because 16/100 simplifies to 4/25. So let's try it down here. Let's try 14/99. Do you think it's going to simplify? Nope. It didn't simplify. So there is my answer. 0.75. Oh, it's actually 75/100. 75/100, because there are 2 decimals, which is the hundredths place. 75/100 over 100 is 3/4. So these are the directions for converting, changing decimals to fractions. You need to know, is it terminating? Does it end? Follow these rules. Is it a repeating decimal? Does it repeat a pattern? Follow these rules.